The rain sounds different when you're waiting for something to end. Not the sharp percussion of a summer storm, but something softer, more persistent, like fingers tapping against glass, patient and relentless. I sit in the plastic chair that's been molded to fit no one's body comfortably, my duffel bag at my feet like a faithful dog that doesn't know where we're going next. The bus station clock reads 11:47, though I stopped trusting it an hour ago when I realized the minute hand hadn't moved. The fluorescent lights above me hum with the kind of frequency that gets into your bones, makes you aware of your own heartbeat. There's something about artificial light at night that strips everything bare, makes every surface look tired and every face look older than it should. I keep my hands buried deep in my coat pockets, fingers wrapped around the crumpled bus ticket that was supposed to take me somewhere else. Anywhere else. The paper is soft now from my touch, edges worn smooth like a worry stone. I should probably throw it away, but holding on to it feels like holding on to the possibility that I could still leave, that I could still be the person who runs. Across from me, maybe 20 feet away, Emery Calloway paces like a caged animal. I've been trying not to look at him directly for the better part of an hour, but peripheral vision has its own betrayals. He moves like he's fighting with the air itself, each step deliberate but restless. His phone appears in his hand, disappears into his pocket, appears again. The rhythm of it is almost hypnotic. There's a matchbook in his other hand. I noticed it when he first walked in, shaking it like a maraca when he thinks, the sound small and hollow in the empty space. It's from Mickey's Diner, the place where he works, where I've seen him through the windows during my walks to nowhere. The matchbook is red and white, probably left over from when people still smoked in restaurants. Now just a nervous habit he carries like a rosary. I know I shouldn't be here. No, I should have gotten on that earlier bus, the one that left at 8:30 with 3 other passengers and a driver who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. But my brother's words are still echoing in my head, each syllable sharp enough to cut. The way he looked at me when I told him I needed to think to figure things out. The way his face closed off like a door slamming shut. You don't get to figure anything out, Luca. You either grow up or you don't. The memory sits in my chest like a stone. I shift in the uncomfortable chair, and the movement catches Emery's attention. For a moment, our eyes meet across the space between us, and something passes there. Not recognition exactly, but acknowledgement. Like two people standing at the edge of the same cliff, wondering who'll jump first. He stops pacing then, stops shaking the matchbook. The sudden stillness is more jarring than his movement had been. I can see him clearly now in the harsh light. The way his dark hair falls across his forehead, the line of his jaw, the careful way he holds himself like he's balancing something fragile. There's a quality to him that I've noticed before in those brief encounters around town. He moves through the world like he's used to being watched, but has never quite gotten comfortable with it. I wonder what he sees when he looks at me. Probably just another small-town kid with nowhere important to go, killing time in a bus station because it's better than going home to face whatever waits there. I wonder if he can tell that I've been thinking about him more than I should, that I know his work schedule better than my own, that I've memorized the way he laughs at something his coworker says when he doesn't think anyone's listening. The truth is, I've been circling around Emery Calloway for weeks like a moth around a flame, getting close enough to feel the heat, but never close enough to get burned. It's safer that way. In a town where everyone knows everyone else's business, where whispers travel faster than wildfire. Safety means keeping your distance from anything that might reveal too much about who you really are. But here we are, alone in this fluorescent-lit purgatory, and distance feels like a luxury I can no longer afford. He takes a step toward me, then another. The sound of his footsteps echoes off the tile floor, each one deliberate and final. When he speaks, his voice cuts through the hum of the lights and the whisper of rain against glass. Stay here tonight, before I change my mind. The words hang in the air between us like smoke. Not a question, not quite a command. Something more dangerous than either. An invitation wrapped in vulnerability, offered with the kind of reckless honesty that can change everything in the span of a heartbeat. I feel my breath catch in my throat. Feel the world narrow down to this moment, this choice, this precipice we're both standing on. The rational part of my mind starts cataloging all the reasons to say no, to pick up my duffel bag and walk out into the rain and never look back. But there's another part of me, a part I've been trying to ignore for weeks, that recognizes this moment for what it is. A door opening. A chance to stop running from something I haven't even admitted to myself yet. Emery's eyes don't leave mine as he waits for my answer. There's something vulnerable in his expression, something that makes him look younger than his 23 years. Like he's offered me something precious and is waiting to see if I'll handle it carefully or let it shatter on the ground between us. The rain continues its patient drumming against the windows. The clock on the wall still reads 11:47, frozen in this moment that feels like it could stretch into eternity. Somewhere in the building, a vending machine hums to life, dispensing something to someone I can't see. I think about my brother, about the disappointment in his voice when he told me I needed to make a choice about my life, about growing up and figuring things out and all the ways I've been failing to do either. I think about the apartment I was supposed to go back to, with its empty refrigerator and unpaid bills stacked on the kitchen counter like a monument to my inability to get my life together. And then I think about the way Emery looks at me sometimes when he thinks I'm not paying attention, like he sees something in me that even I don't know is there. My heart is beating so loud I'm sure he can hear it from across the room. The duffel bag at my feet suddenly feels impossibly heavy, weighted down with all the reasons I should leave. But my body doesn't move toward it. Instead, I find myself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the gravity of this moment, this choice, this boy who's offering me something I've been too afraid to name. The fluorescent lights continue their electric hum above us, bearing witness to whatever comes next. The rain keeps its steady rhythm against the glass, washing the world clean while we stand here in this in-between space, balanced on the knife's edge between one life and another. Stay here tonight, before I change my mind. The words echo in the silence between us, patient and persistent as the rain outside. And for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, to that morning when I woke up thinking it would be just another day in a string of identical days. The kind of morning where you can predict every hour that follows, each one folding into the next like origami made from routine and resignation. My alarm went off at 6:15, same as always. The sound cut through the thin walls of my apartment like a blade, jarring me from whatever dream I'd been having. I don't remember the dream now, but I remember the feeling it left behind. Something about flying or maybe falling. The distinction gets blurrier every morning. The apartment smells like detergent and defeat. That's what I tell myself when I'm being dramatic, which is more often than I'd like to admit. But it's true. The laundromat downstairs pumps its industrial soap scent up through the floorboards, mixing with the cigarette smoke that seeps through the walls from Mrs. Chen next door. She smokes Marlboro lights with mechanical precision, one every hour on the hour, like she's taking medicine. I made coffee in the same chipped mug I've been using for 2 years, the one with the faded logo from some restaurant I've never been to. Probably a gift from someone who thought they knew me better than they did. The coffee tastes like burnt hope, but I drink it anyway because caffeine is one of the few things that makes mornings bearable. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked back at me with the same tired eyes, the same tousled brown hair that never does what I want it to do. 22 years old and already feeling like I'd missed something important, like there was a memo about how to be an adult that everyone received except me. I brush my teeth with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from doing the same thing every day for years, not really seeing myself, just going through the motions. Work at Morrison's Grocery is exactly what you'd expect from a job that pays $8.50 an hour and requires you to ask if people found everything they needed with genuine enthusiasm. The fluorescent lights, they're different from the ones at the bus station, but equally unforgiving. They make everything look slightly yellow, like the world is developing jaundice. I've learned to keep my head down, to stock shelves and run register, and make small talk about the weather with customers who see right through me. Mrs. Patterson always complains about her arthritis. Mr. Rodriguez always buys the same brand of beer and lottery tickets. Jenny Morrison, the owner's daughter, always asks about my love life with the kind of nosiness that passes for friendliness in small towns. Any girlfriends yet, Luca? You're too handsome to be single. I've gotten good at deflecting questions like that. Good at changing the subject to something safer, something that doesn't require me to examine too closely why the idea of dating any of the girls in town makes me feel like I'm wearing clothes that don't fit. It's easier to be the quiet one, the one who keeps his thoughts to himself and his voice low. That's what I was thinking about during my lunch break, sitting in the stockroom, eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and loneliness. How I'd become an expert at making myself smaller, at taking up less space in conversations and relationships in my own life. How I'd learned to speak quietly because loud voices draw attention, and attention leads to questions I'm not ready to answer. I was thinking about this when I saw him through the window. Emery was walking past on the sidewalk, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, that restless energy evident even from a distance. I'd seen him before, of course. In a town this size, you see everyone before. But this was different. This was me actually looking, actually allowing myself to notice the way he moved through space like he was listening to music no one else could hear. He worked at Mickey's Diner, the place with the red vinyl booths and the coffee that was somehow both too strong and too weak at the same time. I'd seen him there through the windows during my aimless evening walks. The ones I took when staying in my apartment felt too much like giving up. He moved behind the counter with an efficiency that suggested he'd done this work before, in other towns, other diners, other lives. There was something about him that didn't quite fit. Not in the way that made people suspicious, but in the way that made you curious. Like he carried stories with him that were bigger than this place, more complicated than the simple narrative of small-town life that most of us wore like uniforms. I found myself taking those walks more often after that, telling myself I needed the exercise, needed the fresh air, needed anything other than another night of scrolling through social media and watching other people live their lives. But really, I was hoping for glimpses of him through the diner windows, hoping to catch sight of that quick laugh I'd heard once when his co-worker said something funny, hoping to understand what it was about him that made my chest tighten in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. We never spoke during those weeks of careful orbiting, never did more than catch each other's reflection in store windows, never exchanged more than polite nods when our paths crossed on the street. But there was something building between us anyway, something unspoken and electric that made the air feel different when he was nearby. I knew it was dangerous. In a place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where secrets have a half-life measured in hours rather than years, allowing yourself to want something you're not supposed to want is like walking through a minefield blindfolded. But knowing something is dangerous and being able to stop yourself from wanting it are two entirely different things. And as I sat in that stockroom, watching Emery disappear around the corner, I realized I'd been lying to myself about a lot of things, including how long I'd been waiting for someone exactly like him to walk into my carefully constructed, quietly desperate life. But that careful distance I'd been maintaining shattered that evening. The same day, I'd watched him walk past the grocery store window. It started with my brother calling just as my shift ended, his voice tight with the kind of controlled anger that meant he'd been thinking about this conversation for hours. "We need to talk. Tonight." There was no room for negotiation in those 4 words. Marcus had raised me after our parents died in that car accident when I was 16, and he still spoke to me, sometimes like I was that lost kid who couldn't figure out how to work the washing machine or remember to pay the electric bill. The difference was, back then I needed that kind of guidance. Now it felt like wearing clothes that were 3 sizes too small. I took the long way to his house, the one that wound through the old part of town where the streetlights cast everything in amber pools and the shadows between them seemed deeper than they should. I knew what the conversation would be about before I got there. I'd seen the look on his face when I'd told him I wasn't sure about going back to community college in the fall, when I'd said I needed time to figure things out. His living room felt like a courtroom when I walked in. Marcus sat in the same chair our father used to occupy, the one with the worn arms and the view of the front yard where we played catch when we were kids and the world made more sense. But there was no nostalgia in his expression, just the weight of responsibility he never asked for and the frustration of watching me drift through life without a plan. You can't keep doing this, Luca. Working part-time at a grocery store, living in that apartment that's falling apart, pretending like you're going to figure something out eventually. You're 22 years old. The words came at me like stones thrown with precision, each one finding its mark. I tried to explain that I was trying, that I just needed more time, that maybe college wasn't the right path for everyone. But even as I said the words, they sounded hollow in my own ears. Excuses dressed up as philosophy. What are you even looking for? He asked me, and the question hung in the air like smoke. What is it you think you're going to find that the rest of us missed? I couldn't tell him that I wasn't looking for something as much as I was running from something. That every time I tried to picture my future, the images felt like photographs of someone else's life. That the thought of settling into the same kind of routine that had swallowed every adult I knew made me feel like I was drowning in slow motion. I couldn't tell him that sometimes, late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I wondered what it would feel like to be the kind of person who could want things openly, who could admit to desires that didn't fit neatly into the categories everyone expected, who could look at someone like Emery Calloway and not immediately catalog all the reasons why that kind of attraction was dangerous. Instead, I mumbled something about needing space to think, about wanting to make sure I was making the right choices. The kind of non-answer that had become my specialty over the years. That's when his patience finally snapped. That's when he told me I didn't get to figure anything out, that I either grew up or I didn't. That he'd sacrificed enough of his own life keeping me afloat, and he couldn't keep watching me waste the opportunities he'd never had. You either grow up or you don't. The words followed me out of his house and onto the street, echoing with each step I took toward nowhere in particular. I found myself walking without direction, letting my feet carry me through the familiar geography of disappointment that had become my life. Past the grocery store where I spent 40 hours a week pretending to care about customer service. Past the community college where I was supposed to be planning my future. Past all the places that felt like they belonged to someone else's story. That's how I ended up at the bus station. Not because I had anywhere to go, but because it was the only place in town that acknowledged the possibility of leaving. I bought a ticket to the state capitol, not because I wanted to go there, but because it was the next bus out, and having the ticket in my pocket felt like holding onto a secret door. The station was nearly empty when I arrived. Just me and the tired-looking woman behind the counter who barely looked up when I walked in. I chose a seat near the window where I could watch the rain that had started falling just after sunset, each drop catching the light from the street lamps outside before sliding down the glass like tears. I was thinking about Marcus, about the disappointment in his voice and the way he'd looked at me like I was a puzzle he'd given up trying to solve. I was thinking about the ticket in my pocket and whether having an escape route made me brave or just pathetic. I was thinking about all the ways I'd learned to make myself smaller, quieter, safer. That's when Emery walked in. He appeared in the doorway, like an answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking, shaking rain from his dark hair and carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from Mickey's Diner. The sight of him there, in that fluorescent-lit space where I'd come to hide from my own life, felt like the kind of coincidence that only happens in movies or dreams. He looked around the empty station, his eyes finding mine across the distance between us. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked over, his footsteps echoing off the tile floor, and sat down beside me without asking permission. "Rough night?" he asked, offering me one of the coffee cups. The question was simple, but the way he asked it wasn't. There was something in his voice that suggested he understood what rough nights felt like, that he'd sat in places like this before, waiting for something to change or end or begin. I took the coffee, our fingers brushing as he handed it to me. The touch lasted barely a second, but it sent electricity up my arm and straight to my chest. The coffee was still warm, and it tasted better than anything had in hours. "Something like that," I said. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain against the windows and the hum of the vending machines. There was something about being there with him that made the fluorescent lights seem less harsh, made the plastic chairs seem less uncomfortable. like his presence had changed the fundamental nature of the space. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet but clear. "You know, I've got a couch, if you need somewhere to stay tonight." And that's how I found myself following him through rain-darkened streets that glistened like black mirrors under the streetlights. My duffel bag felt lighter in my hand than it had all evening, as if the simple act of accepting his invitation had changed its weight, transformed it from anchor to possibility. Emery walked slightly ahead of me, his pace unhurried but purposeful, like someone who had made peace with the direction his feet were taking him. The rain had softened to a mist that clung to everything it touched, turning the familiar streets of our small town into something from a half-remembered dream. I'd walked these sidewalks hundreds of times before, but following Emery through them felt like discovering a new country hidden inside the geography I thought I knew. Each block we covered took us further from the bus station, further from the life I'd been trying to escape, and deeper into territory I'd never allowed myself to explore. His apartment was above Murphy's laundromat on 3rd Street, the kind of building that had probably been elegant once, maybe 60 years ago, before the paint started peeling and the front steps developed that slight sag that spoke of too much time and not enough money for repairs. A narrow staircase led up from a side entrance, the kind of stairs that creaked with stories of everyone who had ever climbed them seeking refuge or running from something they couldn't name. The scent hit me the moment he opened the door. Industrial detergent from the laundromat below. Yes, but layered underneath was something warmer. Cinnamon and yeast from the bakery next door, where they started their morning bread at 4 a.m. Coffee that had been brewed strong and left to grow cold. Something else, too. Something that might have been incense, or just the accumulated smell of a person who read books late into the night and kept plants alive despite limited sunlight. "It's not much," he said, shrugging off his jacket and hanging it on a hook by the door. "But it's warm and the coffee's better than what they serve at the bus station." The apartment was small in the way that forced you to make deliberate choices about what deserved space in your life. A couch that had probably been expensive once, now faded to the color of old denim, but still solid, still comfortable. A bookshelf made from boards and cinder blocks, packed with paperbacks whose spines were creased from being opened too many times. A kitchen that was really just a corner with a stove and a sink, but organized with the kind of efficiency that spoke of someone who had learned to make do with less. There were plants everywhere, not the kind of expensive, perfectly maintained plants that people use as decoration, but the hardy survivors. Spider plants cascading from macrame hangers, a snake plant in the corner that looked like it could outlive us all, herbs growing in mason jars on the windowsill. The kind of green things that thrive on neglect and forgiveness, that keep giving oxygen and beauty even when their caretaker forgets to water them for a week. "Make yourself at home," he said, disappearing into the kitchen corner. I heard the sound of water running, the clink of mugs being retrieved from cabinets. Normal domestic sounds that somehow felt profound in their ordinariness, like I was witnessing the private rituals of a life I'd only glimpsed from outside. I set my duffel bag down by the couch and looked around more carefully. There were photographs tucked into the frame of a mirror, not the pose kind that families take at holidays, but casual snapshots of places and people. A city skyline I didn't recognize. Someone's hands wrapped around a coffee cup. A sunset taken from what looked like a rooftop somewhere far from here. The images suggested a history of movement, of temporary attachments and graceful departures. "You've lived a lot of places," I said when he emerged from the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs. "A few," he replied, handing me the coffee. His fingers brushed mine again, and this time neither of us pulled away immediately. The touch lingered just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to shift something in the air between us. We settled onto the couch, close enough that our knees almost touched, far enough apart that the space between us hummed with possibility. The coffee was good, dark and rich with a hint of cinnamon that made me think of early mornings and new beginnings. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the windows were still streaked with water that caught the light from passing cars and scattered it across the walls in moving patterns. "So what brings you to our charming metropolis?" I asked, attempting lightness, but hearing something more vulnerable in my own voice. "Work, mostly," he said, but there was more to it than that. I could hear the unfinished story in his tone, the carefully curated version of truth that people offer when they're not ready to share the full complexity of their choices. Same as everyone, I guess. Looking for something different. Different from what? He was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee like it held answers. From always being the person everyone expected me to be, he said finally. From pretending that wanting something meant you were weak or selfish or broken. The words settled between us like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything that had come before. I recognized something in them, some echo of my own struggles to name desires that didn't fit into the neat categories everyone else seemed to navigate so easily. I know that feeling, I said, and immediately wondered if I'd revealed too much, if I'd stepped across some line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Emery just nodded, his eyes meeting mine with something that looked like relief, like he'd been waiting for someone to understand what he meant without him having to explain it in smaller words. The conversation that followed meandered like a river, finding its way to the sea. We talked about books, about the ways small towns could feel like prisons or sanctuaries, depending on your perspective. About jobs we'd hated and dreams we'd abandoned, and the strange comfort of starting over in places where nobody knew your history. About the difference between loneliness and solitude, and how sometimes the thing you thought would save you turned out to be just another way of hiding from yourself. His laugh was quick and genuine when something struck him as funny, but there were shadows behind his eyes when he mentioned cities he'd left, people he didn't keep in touch with anymore. I found myself leaning forward without realizing it, drawn by the way his hands moved when he talked, the way his voice dropped when he was saying something he considered important. Somewhere in the middle of a story about a job he'd had in Portland, I became acutely aware of the space between us on the couch, of the way the light from the lamp beside us painted the line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth when he smiled, of how my own skin felt suddenly too sensitive, like I was becoming aware of every nerve ending at once. The air between us grew charged with something unnamed but unmistakable. The kind of electricity that makes you hyper-conscious of your own breathing, of the way fabric feels against your skin, of the precise distance between your body and someone else's. When our conversation naturally lulled into silence, it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we weren't saying yet, everything we were both afraid to reach for. I must have fallen asleep at some point during our conversation, because I woke to the sound of a window sliding open and the soft scratch of a match being struck. The apartment was dark except for the amber glow from the street lamp outside, casting everything in shades of gold and shadow that made the familiar space feel like something from a dream. The couch where I'd been lying was still warm from my body. The blanket Emery must have draped over me sometime after I'd drifted off, carrying the faint scent of laundry detergent and something else, something distinctly him. I blinked away the fog of sleep and found him sitting on the floor beside the open window, his back against the wall, a cigarette between his fingers sending thin streams of smoke into the night air. In a low light, with his face turned toward the window and his features softened by shadow, he looked different. Younger somehow, despite the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. More vulnerable than the confident person who had appeared at the bus station with coffee and easy conversation. Like the darkness had stripped away whatever armor he wore during daylight hours, leaving behind someone more raw, more real. "I thought you'd left," he said without turning to look at me, his voice barely above a whisper. The words carried the weight of someone who had been abandoned before, who had learned to expect departure rather than hope for permanence. I shifted on the couch, the leather creaking softly under my weight. My mouth felt dry from sleep, and there was a crick in my neck from the angle I'd been lying at. But I didn't want to move too quickly, didn't want to break whatever spell the darkness had cast over this moment. "Still here," I said, my own voice rough with sleep. He took a long drag from his cigarette, and I watched the ember glow bright orange in the darkness before fading back to a dull red. The smoke curled up and out the window, dissipating into the night air that still carried the dampness of earlier rain. Somewhere in the distance, a car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the wall before disappearing around a corner. "Can't sleep either?" I asked, though it was obvious from his posture, from the way he held himself like someone keeping vigil, that sleep had been eluding him long before I'd woken up. He shook his head, finally turning to look at me. In the amber light from outside, his eyes looked darker than they had earlier, more serious. Something in his expression made my chest tighten, made me suddenly aware of how quiet the world was around us, how isolated we were in this small space above the sleeping laundromat. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, he continued, his voice so soft I had to strain to hear it, about knowing that feeling, about pretending to be someone else. I pulled myself up to sitting, the blanket falling away from my shoulders. The air in the apartment was cool, but not cold, carrying the mingled scents of his cigarette and the cinnamon from the bakery below. My heart had started beating faster, though I couldn't say exactly why. Something about the way he was looking at me, like he was trying to decide whether to say something that couldn't be taken back. What about it? I asked, though part of me already knew where this was heading, could feel it in the charged air between us, in the way the darkness seemed to press closer around the small circle of light where we sat today. He took another drag from his cigarette, then stubbed it out on the windowsill, the ember dying with a small hiss. When he looked at me again, there was something different in his expression, something vulnerable and brave and terrified all at once. I moved here because I was tired of hiding, he said, tired of being careful about who I looked at, how long I looked, what that might mean. Tired of pretending that wanting something made me wrong or broken or dangerous. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to take back once they'd been spoken. I felt my breath catch in my throat, felt the world narrow down to this moment, this confession, this boy sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his heart laid open like a book. I know the feeling, I said again, but this time the words carried more weight, more truth. This time they weren't just an echo of sympathy, but an admission of my own. He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the dim light, like he was trying to read something written there in a language he was still learning. Then, slowly, he moved from the window to the edge of the couch, close enough that I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, close enough that our knees brushed when he settled beside me. The touch was electric, sending warmth shooting up my leg and straight to my chest. Neither of us pulled away this time. Instead, we sat there in the golden darkness, our bodies close enough to share warmth, close enough that I could hear the slight catch in his breathing that matched my own. "Luca," he said, and my name in his voice sounded different than it ever had before, like he was tasting it, testing how it felt on his tongue. "Yeah. I don't want to assume anything," he continued, his voice careful but steady. "But if I'm reading this wrong, if I'm seeing something that isn't there, tell me now, before I do something we can't take back." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it in the quiet apartment. Every rational thought in my head was cataloging reasons to say yes, he was reading it wrong, to pull back before we crossed a line that would change everything. But there was another voice, quieter but stronger, that had been waiting for this moment longer than I'd been willing to admit. Instead of answering with words, I reached out and touched his hand where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm under my fingers, and when I traced the line from his knuckles to his wrist, I felt him shiver in response. "You're not reading it wrong," I said, my voice barely audible even in the silence. He turned his hand palm up, letting our fingers intertwine. The simple gesture felt monumental, like we were signing a contract written in a language of touch and breath and shared silence. When he leaned closer, slowly enough that I could have stopped him if I'd wanted to, I found myself leaning to meet him halfway. The kiss started tentative, questioning, like he was still giving me a chance to change my mind. But when I didn't pull away, when I let my free hand find the curve of his jaw and draw him closer, something shifted between us. The kiss deepened, became something hungrier, more certain. He tasted like coffee gone cold and the faintest trace of rain still clinging to his lips. Like possibility and fear and the kind of honesty that only comes in the dark hours when the world feels small enough to hold in your hands. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing harder than we had been moments before, he rested his forehead against mine. In that instant, with our breath mingling in the amber darkness and our hands still intertwined, I realized something that should have terrified me, but didn't. I realized I'd been waiting for this moment, not just since I'd met Emery, but for my entire life. Waiting for someone to see the part of me I'd kept hidden, to reach for it without flinching, to make me feel like wanting something didn't make me broken. I realized I'd been waiting for him. Morning arrived like a blade of light slicing through the blinds, sharp and unforgiving in the way that only sunlight can be after a night that changed everything. I woke sprawled on the couch with Emery's arm draped over my chest, his breathing slow and steady against my shoulder. For a moment, before the full weight of consciousness settled over me, I existed in that perfect liminal space where the night before felt like both dream and absolute reality. Then my phone started buzzing on the coffee table where I'd left it, the screen lighting up with notification after notification. 6 missed calls from Marcus. 3 voicemails. A string of text messages that started concerned and escalated to angry and finally landed somewhere in the territory of resigned disappointment that hurt worse than his fury ever could. Where are you? Call me back. Luca, seriously call me. I know you're upset, but this isn't the answer. Fine. When you're ready to be an adult about this, you know where to find me. Each message was a reminder of the life I'd walked away from last night. The expectations I'd been carrying like stones in my pockets for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to move without their weight. The life where Marcus worried about me, but didn't understand me. Where Mrs. Patterson asked about my love life, and I deflected with practiced ease. Where I made myself smaller and quieter and safer with each passing day. Emery stirred beside me, his arm tightening slightly around my ribs before he fully woke up and remembered where we were, what had happened between us in the amber darkness. I felt his body tense for just a moment, that universal instant of mourning after vulnerability when you're not sure if the person beside you regrets everything that led to this moment. Morning, he said, his voice rough with sleep but warm, reassuring in its steadiness. Morning, I replied, though I didn't turn to look at him yet. I was afraid of what I might see in his expression, afraid of the possibility that daylight had transformed last night's revelation into something he wanted to take back. The buzzing of my phone filled the silence between us, another call from Marcus that I let go to voicemail. The sound seemed obscenely loud in the quiet apartment, an intrusion from the world outside that reminded us both that this small space above the laundromat wasn't separate from reality, just temporarily insulated from it. Popular this morning, Emery observed, but there was no judgment in his voice, just quiet understanding. My brother, I said, finally turning to face him. In the morning light streaming through the blinds, he looked different again. Not vulnerable like he had in the darkness, but not quite the confident person from the diner either. Something in between, someone real and complicated and worth knowing better. He nodded, and I could see him processing what that meant. The implications of family calling repeatedly when you'd spent the night somewhere unexpected. The weight of other people's expectations and the way they could feel like chains even when they came from love. You should probably call him back, he said, but there was something careful in his voice, like he was trying not to influence my decision while still acknowledging the reality of it. I agreed, but I didn't reach for the phone. Instead, I found myself studying the way the light played across his face, memorizing the details I'd only glimpsed in the darkness. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hair stuck up at odd angles from sleep, the precise color of his eyes in daylight, brown with flecks of gold that caught the morning sun. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken questions. What happens now? What was last night? Are we pretending this was just a moment of weakness, or are we admitting it was something more? Emery sat up slowly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I watched him gather himself, saw the way he carefully didn't look at me directly as he stood up and moved toward the kitchen. The distance felt sudden and vast, like he was already preparing for me to leave, already protecting himself from the disappointment of abandonment. Coffee? He asked, his back to me as he filled the kettle with water. Yeah, thanks. I heard him moving around the small kitchen, the familiar sounds of morning routine that should have been comforting but instead felt like a countdown. Each clink of ceramic, each footstep on the worn linoleum, brought us closer to the moment when I would have to choose between the safety of my old life and the terrifying possibility of this new one. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Marcus, shorter this time, but somehow more devastating in its simplicity. Just tell me you're okay. 3 words that contained everything I'd been running from the night before. His worry, his love, his need to keep me safe in a world that felt increasingly dangerous the more honest I became about who I really was. The weight of being someone's responsibility, someone's project, someone's source of constant concern. But also 3 words that reminded me of everything I'd be giving up if I stayed. The security of being known, even if that knowing was incomplete. The comfort of routine, even if that routine felt like slowly suffocating. The safety of expectations, even if meeting them meant denying the parts of myself that had been awakening in the darkness of this apartment. Emery returned with 2 steaming mugs, setting one on the coffee table in front of me before settling into the chair across from the couch. The distance between us felt intentional now, a careful space that allowed me room to make my choice without the influence of his proximity. "He's worried about you," Emery said, nodding toward my still buzzing phone. "Yeah, he raised me after our parents died. Sometimes I think he forgets I'm not 16 anymore. That's a lot of responsibility for both of you." I picked up my coffee, grateful for something to do with my hands, some warmth to counteract the chill that had settled in my chest. The coffee was perfect, strong, and rich with that hint of cinnamon that was becoming familiar, that was starting to taste like possibility. "He doesn't understand," I said finally. "About last night, about any of this. About who I really am underneath all the ways I've learned to be careful." Emery was quiet for a moment, his own coffee cradled between his palms like he was using it to warm something deeper than his hands. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone," he said eventually. "But you do have to live with whatever choice you make. And I need you to know that if you walk out that door right now, if you decide this was just one night and nothing more, I'm not going to chase after you. I'm not going to try to convince you to want something you're not ready to want." The words hit me like cold water, shocking in their honesty and their finality. He wasn't making this easier for me by offering guarantees or promises of what could be. He was simply laying out the terms, giving me the space to choose without pressure, but also without safety net. I looked around the apartment that had felt like sanctuary just hours before, at the plants growing in impossible conditions, at the photographs of places I'd never been, at the life someone had built from scratch in a space above a laundromat. I thought about the version of myself that had walked into the bus station last night, angry and lost, and carrying a ticket to nowhere. Then I thought about the version of myself that had woken up this morning with someone's arm around me, someone who had seen the parts of me I kept hidden and reached for them anyway. My phone buzzed one more time. Marcus again, probably wondering if I was lying in a ditch somewhere, or just being selfish and irresponsible like he'd accused me of the night before. The choice hung in the air between us like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp, their one moment and dissipating the next. Choose safety or choose honesty. Choose the known disappointment of my old life or the unknown possibilities of whatever this could become. Choose who I wanted to be when no one was watching but me. I set the coffee mug down on the table with deliberate care, the ceramic making a soft sound against the wood that seemed to echo in the quiet apartment. My phone had finally stopped buzzing, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the notifications had. I could feel Emery watching me from across the room, not with expectation, but with the kind of patient attention that suggested he understood the magnitude of whatever decision I was working toward. The morning light had grown stronger while we sat there, transforming the golden shadows of dawn into the clear, unforgiving brightness of full day. Through the window, I could see the ordinary world going about its business. People walking to work with coffee cups and purposeful strides. Cars navigating the familiar streets with the automatic precision of routine. Life continuing in all the ways it always had, indifferent to the small revolution happening in this apartment above the laundromat. I stood up from the couch, my legs unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with having slept in an awkward position. The movement felt significant, like the first step of a journey whose destination I couldn't yet see clearly. My duffel bag sat by the door, where I'd left it the night before, packed with everything I'd thought I needed to escape my life. Now it looked smaller somehow, insufficient for whatever came next. I walked over to the window where Emery had been smoking in the darkness hours earlier, where he'd first told me about being tired of hiding. The street below looked different in daylight, less mysterious but somehow more real. I could see the bus stop 2 blocks away, where I'd sat waiting for something to change. The diner where Emery worked, its neon sign dark but still promising warmth and sustenance to anyone who needed it. The grocery store where I'd spent so many hours making myself smaller, quieter, safer. All of it was still there, waiting for me to return to the person I'd been yesterday. The person who kept his voice low and his desires unnamed, who deflected questions about his love life with practiced ease, who had learned to measure his worth by how little trouble he caused for everyone else. But I wasn't that person anymore. Or maybe I was, but I was also someone else now. Someone who had been seen in the darkness and not found wanting. Someone who had been offered honesty and found the courage to return it. Someone who had tasted possibility and discovered it was sweeter than the safety I'd been clinging to. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Marcus, my fingers moving slowly across the screen as I chose each word with care. I'm okay. I'm safe. I need some time to figure things out, but I'm not running away. I'll call you later. It wasn't everything he wanted to hear, but it was the truth. More truth than I'd given him in months of careful conversations and deflected questions. It would have to be enough for now. I sent the message and turned back toward the room, toward Emery, who was still sitting in the chair with his coffee, watching me with those brown eyes that had seen me clearly in the darkness and hadn't looked away. I'm not going anywhere, I said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff, like jumping without knowing if there was water below or just rocks and regret. He nodded slowly, as if my decision was something he'd been hoping for but hadn't wanted to influence. As if he understood that some choices have to be made in solitude, even when they affect more than one person. I walked back to the couch, but instead of sitting down, I moved past it to where my duffel bag waited by the door. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, and carried it to the corner of the room where it wouldn't be in the way, where it could stay until I figured out what came next, until I learned how to live as the person I was becoming instead of the person I'd been trained to be. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental, like claiming space in a life I'd never allowed myself to imagine having. Emery stood up then, crossing the room to where I was standing. He didn't say anything, just reached out and took my hand in his, our fingers interlacing with the same natural ease they'd found in the darkness. His palm was warm against mine, steady and real and present in a way that made everything else feel possible. Good, he said simply, and there was something in his voice that sounded like relief, like gratitude, like the beginning of a conversation that could last years. We stood there in the morning light that streamed through the windows, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of places and decided to see what could grow from that finding. The apartment smelled like coffee and cinnamon and the lingering trace of rain from the night before. Outside, the world continued its familiar patterns, but inside this small space above the laundromat, something new was taking root. There were no declarations of love, no promises about forever. We were too young and too honest to pretend we knew what the future held, too aware of how fragile new things could be to weigh them down with expectations they might not be ready to carry. But there was something else, something quieter but no less significant. There was the recognition that we had found each other at exactly the moment when we were both ready to stop hiding from who we really were. There was the understanding that some connections are worth the risk, worth the uncertainty, worth the courage it takes to choose authenticity over safety. I heard the sound of 2 coffee cups being set on the table, ceramic against wood, a domestic symphony that spoke of mornings and continuity and the simple pleasure of sharing space with someone who saw you clearly. Steam curled upward from both mugs, disappearing into the warm air of the apartment that was starting to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a place where something real could begin. The rain outside had stopped hours ago, but the air still carried the clean scent of it, the promise of things washed new and ready for whatever came next. Whatever that was, I would meet it here in this space above the laundromat with this person who had offered me honesty and waited patiently while I found the courage to accept it. For now, I stayed. And for now, that was enough.